Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
It's Ron Crabtree here, back with you for another episode of MetaPod, and really challenged with those three common things, right? The forever labor shortage, digital transformation, digitization of work, and then just plain you've got to do more with less. And that's a phenomenon that affects everybody, and in particular, people involved with tangible goods. And if you operate profit and loss, you have responsibility for operational performance, or you're an advisor, or you're on a board of directors, and you're in a role where there's what do we do to improve performance? In the face of these challenges, and I think you're going to particularly like our guest here today, David Hewitt, is going to join us. And I met David a couple of years ago when he was in the UK looking to make a move back to the United States, and actually tried to hire David, but an international company snapped him up to run one of their U.S. businesses. And I found his insights to be incredibly helpful and very, to the point and practical with respect to what organizations can do to cope with these sorts of challenges, particularly around doing more with less of everything, right? People, resources, et cetera, while improving performance in an organization. So I think you'll find this episode particularly refreshing if you're involved in any way with tangible goods and distribution and looking for ways we can improve performance in the face of those challenges. So David, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, first, thanks for having me, Ron. So I'm a CEO with a commercial background, originally from the UK, as you said, but now living in Charlotte, North Carolina. Despite my commercial background, I got thrust into operations and running a P&L early on in my career. I have experience leading international multi-site businesses for both private equity and publicly traded companies in Asia. I spent 5 years in China, in Europe, and of course in North America. I've done startups, turnarounds, and performance step changes. And the interesting thing that I find is much of what I've seen by industry, by region, by type of company are consistent and transferable. And I think identifying waste in an organization and eliminating that waste is consistent across all those categories.
All right, awesome. So what we'd like to do in this podcast is kind of ask you to share some diagnostics, picking three key areas you think organizations generically and uniformly probably should be looking at, and help us understand why we would look at that, how we might measure that, and how would we gauge the degree of the threat or the challenge or the opportunity. And we'll pivot back and talk more about what do you do about that later on in the podcast. So with that, why don't you jump in here and share with us, what should we really be looking at in the face of these challenges?
Yeah, so I think if we focus on kind of the subject of doing more with less and identifying waste in your organization, I think capitalism ensures that it's inevitable that if you don't innovate, if you don't leverage new technologies and new processes, you're not going to survive. And I think there's plenty of stories about well-established companies that didn't pivot with the times and they suffered. I'll talk through some of my personal methodology about how you do more with less. But the first thing I would say is I would reframe that. When you say do more with less in an organization, it has a lot of negative connotations. And I think also I'd much rather look at it at achieving more rather than doing more. Too often businesses are just focused on activity. And really that's not the definition of operational efficiency. It's what do you do and does it achieve the end result? And I think another way of looking at it is, can you achieve more by doing less? So the first step for me is to answer your question is I see a lot of waste and it starts at the very top and it cascades all the way down through the organization. One of the authors that I've really appreciated when it comes to strategy is Michael Porter. And he often says the key to strategy is choosing what you don't do. And I think that plays into what are the business priorities? Because if the business is reinventing its strategy and its tactics once a month after every kind of board meeting, then it just confuses and it generates waste in the organization. So the best thing you can do as a leader is to give a simple set of key initiatives that align with the strategy and the vision of the company. And if you do that, and obviously ensure that there's good governance and KPIs around that, if you do that, straight away, you'll be eliminating waste in the organization because everyone will be acting lean and focused on the key priorities.
All right. Let me butt in for a second here. I'm also an advocate of, keeping things simple. You think about policy deployment and Ocean Connery and this notion that there's a few key things you're driving change around in an organization and focused on what we're going to try to improve. The one most important goal that my friend Jim Gibney talks about, right? And the whole organization wrapped around that. Maybe you could share a little story with us or an example of, you don't have to disclose anything confidential here, but tell us a story about what happened. What did you do? What did you discover? Could you have evidence of what you were looking for, what you found?
Yeah, so I can think of one company where I came in and the strategy was very fractured. Everyone had a different view of what the strategy was. And in some cases where KPIs did exist, the KPIs were competing with each other. So it was a global company, reasonably decentralized. And because the strategy was fractured and the KPIs were in contradiction at times, you had people inadvertently working against each other in terms of this lack of efficiencies. And that translated through to the P&L. I mean, these things often come through to the P&L or employee satisfaction or customer satisfaction. It doesn't stay hidden for long. And by aligning the entire organization in the process of setting the vision, the strategy, the tactics, creating an organization structure to execute that, making them part of the process, and then keeping the key initiatives very lean, right? Just 5 for the year. I mean, 3 to 5 is what I would normally suggest to people. Just by resetting the entire organization around the single vision strategy and 3 to 5 tactics, we're able to eliminate a lot of waste in the process, a lot of contradictions. And that very, very quickly translated to improved customer satisfaction, which we measured through NPS, employee satisfaction.
So NPS would be your net promoter score?
Net promoter score. Yeah. So you often see NPS used, net promoter score used for customer satisfaction. 9 to 10 is promoted, 7 to 8 is neutral, and 1 to 6 is detractor. With a simple question, would you recommend this company to a friend or colleague? Would you put your personal reputation out there to recommend it? I've seen other organizations use it for employees as well, an employee net promoter score too. So quite quickly, we saw the fruits of that alignment, that elimination of waste.
Yeah, could you share some examples of what they went after? You already talked about measuring customer satisfaction and making a delta was one of those few key things. What were some of the other few key things in that case? You don't have to reveal who it was, but what were the key things you really went after in that case, and why did you look at those so closely?
Well, another example would be that because the organization was fractured, the way we handle logistics was inefficient. So you had 4 logistics centers all shipping across each other. So the ships and the planes were crossing each other in the night because the organization simply hadn't been aligned around a key vision strategy and tactics and KPIs. And so you had, for example, I'm going to make up countries just for the sake of it, but you had a company in Italy shipping into Turkey and a company in Turkey shipping into Italy. And what we should have been doing is aligning our business and then localizing shipments out of those local facilities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So that would improve the cost basis, right? So we're going to waste less from a logistics perspective. Did it also have a lift in performance for the customer?
Absolutely, because in that example, the on-time and in full KPI improved dramatically. The ability to communicate in local time zones was marginal improvement, but was an improvement as well. And so these all flow through to the P&L and to the customer.
I think we have a couple now, right? So around the customer net promoter scores and then distribution efficiencies. What was another area that you really focused in this example company and why? You remember?
Yeah, well, I think that the next one I would say is just the methodology and philosophy of an organization aligned with finding and eliminating waste had multiple benefits, right? Because I've given you an example where by being clear and defined and focused from the top, you eliminate waste and you've generated operational improvements because people aren't in contradiction to each other in the way they perform and they operate. But another one is just the philosophy of the company, always challenging the status quo. So if you're infusing now continuous improvement methodologies, people call it Sigma, lean manufacturing, lean management tools, but at the high level, it's challenging the status quo. It's consistent, continuous improvement. If you get the organization understanding the value of that, you get hundreds of micro improvements all the time that aren't being generated from the top. It's been generated from the bottom up. And once you condition the organization to think like that, that's when the magic really, really happens, because that's a multiplier effect, because everyone's thinking the same way. You can argue that you have to roll out standardized templates and methodologies to do that, balanced scorecard, visual management boards, daily huddles, value stream mapping. all those sort of things. And they're all very powerful. But if you can just get the culture level set in that thinking, that will be beneficial.
Yeah, you're hitting on something that, I've been hearing a lot from the guests in my podcast. And as I'm showing up in other people's podcasts, a lot of discussion around culture, a lot of discussion around, people and culture as a roadblock to digital transformation, for example. And, it's classic that, change management has always been the big barrier to lean or lean Six Sigma practices. It's always been the number one reason for failure is just failing to get the people part right. So it sounds like you resonate with that quite a bit. So we want to get really clear about what we're trying to improve and make sure we've got the top-down approach, key things we're working on to turn the lever with respect to performance, and then also making sure we've got cultural alignment. What would be the next thing you'd want to go take a hard look at?
I think you've got your customers focused on, you've got your people focused on, you've got your P&L focused on. And I think if you've got those three things, then a lot of good things happen. I think you mentioned kind of digital tools and maybe by connotation, artificial intelligence. This is not one of my businesses, but a good example of utilizing artificial intelligence, right? To do more with less or to achieve more with less. One of my good friends, he runs a law firm, so it's not business to business, but in that law firm, they have to give kind of 15 to 30 minutes of free consultation at the very beginning of every engagement with a client. And this is a transferable example. And he can't scale because that just means he has to add additional attorneys, additional headcount constantly to provide that 15 to 30 minutes of free consultation before the prospective client becomes a client. And so he's leveraged artificial intelligence. And so it's actually an artificial intelligence replicating his voice, which is kind of interesting, but also a lot of his knowledge. And by doing so, they go through that consultation process with clients without using up the human capital, because the human capital should be focused on billable hours. And to me, that was a really interesting and creative example of how artificial intelligence is a tool to do more with less, much in the way that automation is, or digital tools. I've got another company I know that's in distribution business for components to sub-assembly manufacturers. And he simply didn't want to keep adding OpEx, adding headcount to scale his business through salespeople. So he created a first-class e-commerce platform. And instantly that's scalable. So if you're talking about doing more with less, these are other examples through digital and artificial tools.
All right. So we should be taking a look at in this quest to cope with the forever labor shortage, needing to do more with less, is carefully picking digitization where it directly impacts OpEx, what you're calling OpEx, or adding operational expense. And my audience might get confused when we talk about OpEx in the term of operational excellence, and then we talk about OpEx in the terms of the financial measure of operational expense, right? So I want to make sure we distinguish that for our audience. So you're saying, take a look at what's driving operational expense, particularly if we're trying to scale and get a lot more done and try to cherry pick where precisely we can apply digital tools to get the leverage.
If the exam question is do more with less, right, or achieve more with less, as I put it, then you can't simply be throwing operational expense, additional expense into the business to scale. That's just the contradiction to the exam question. And so you have to be focusing on that. And how do you achieve more by not just constantly throw additional headcount year after year as you grow the top line? And digital and artificial intelligence are great examples. People often talk about ESG, but ESG also has a bottom line benefit as well in terms of how do you produce a product, package a product, distribute a product with lower expense. That's also good for the environment at the same time.
Yeah, so environmental, social, governance, supply chain sustainability. Yeah, so Chris Workman was a guest on one of my podcasts, and that's all he talked about for close to an hour is how do you make sustainability, pay for itself?
Yeah.
And, in ESG, so you're saying that's definitely an area you have to take a good hard look at is, so we're looking for evidence in the organization that we're looking at those mandates, funded and unfunded mandates related to ESG. We're looking at the practical need to do more with less as a business. They're not necessarily independent of one another.
Correct. Yeah.
There can be real synergies saying, wait a minute, to your point, take a hard look at how we design, manufacture, package, transport, and step back from that and saying, what could we do to better, definitely to A, be compliant, and B, drive our costs down at the same time.
That's right. I mean, there's other benefits to it in terms of diversity of perspectives, which helps attract and retain talent, which plays into the forever labor shortage topic that you raised. But in this example, yeah, there's a bottom line effect and it allows you to scale without adding costs, not only in OpEx, but other parts of your P&L.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So from a diagnostics perspective, is there another area you think we should be looking at?
I'm a big believer in the 80-20 principle. And so I think, again, how do you achieve more with less? When you look at the areas that you focus on operationally, but more in my example on the sales side, I'm a big believer in applying the 80-20 principle, because time and time again, it's been proven that in most cases, 20% of your customers achieve 80% of your results. And so how do you align the organization to prioritize them, to capture more of the market share that those customers have, and to grow with them as they grew, which they will do? And again, focusing on the exam question of doing more of less, applying the 80-20 principle, particularly on the commercial side, will pay dividends for the customer experience, the employee experience, and certainly the P&L.
Something I've run into in different industries, and I wonder if you would advocate this or not. And it's almost like a 10-80-10, right? So there's the 10% of your customers that are very profitable. It's a great relationship, and you can argue that as much as 50% of total profits come from just 10% of customers. You have the next 80% that, we make, reasonable margin on, we're doing okay. And then the last 10% that wipe out the first 10% because we throw so much time and money at them. Are you an advocate of actually shedding customers as part of this process?
At the very least, deprioritizing, right? So I've seen a number of times when the long tail of customers, if you're looking at a graph with your customers in terms of the revenues, once you get to that long tail, the amount of revenues you give per customer is very low and the number of customers is very high, hence the long tail expression. And all they do is they absorb resources that could be focused on your top customers. And so at the very least, deprioritize them, or you push them to a route to market, such as an e-commerce platform where you're not putting human capital into the equation. If you want to buy from us, buy for e-commerce platform, but we're not going to give you our technical resources, or we're not going to prioritize you in the same way we will our key accounts.
Yeah, I love that. You're really nailing it in my mind because, I've done some of this stuff myself in the past. I was working with a manufacturing company out of Canada, and they made very complex valves used in chemicals, pharmaceutical, organizations that have to move large volumes of liquids and gas. And we took a hard look at their whole, sales cycle. And what we discovered is they were using the same process for $1 million valve as they'd use for a $500 valve, right?
Yeah.
And the expenses associated with these products. So they did exactly what you talked about. They actually came up with 3 processes. We had a high touch process where it's strategic, high dollar, and high margin. Then you had a intermediate, and then you had a mostly, automated or even offshore, if you will. They can have a third party, they can have their offshore team handle these less complex products. Still pretty high touch, but at much lower cost basis because the opportunities for mistakes and all those other things were greatly reduced and under control. So it sounds like you would advocate for something like that.
Absolutely. I think you have to, because otherwise you're not prioritizing your top accounts, which means you're not getting more of their market share.
Okay, cool. From the diagnostic perspective, is there any other area that you want to examine before we get into the go-dos?
I think the topic I would want to revisit and emphasize a bit more, it goes back to kind of that organizational discipline, right? Because it's so easy to get distracted on the shiny object. I talked a lot about how you set a focused vision, strategy, and tactics, and you have kind of discipline from the top, so that waste doesn't cascade down. You got to maintain that discipline. And I think utilizing KPIs and good governance, and this is a play off lean management principles, I think is so important. So I'm a big believer in, I mentioned earlier, balanced scorecards, where, and one of the things I find interesting is, KPIs, key performance indicators, the amount of companies that have so many KPIs that they're no longer key, that's an example of a lack of discipline. So you've got to be really tight with this, but having a balanced scorecard that you can translate to daily KPIs, every individual knows how they contribute to the department, every department knows how they contribute to the company. They can see it on visual management boards. They can see it come out on daily huddles. They see it in the balanced scorecard. And that's discipline, that governance makes sure that we stay focused, we stay on track, we apply the right principles in the right places.
Okay. In that case, let's pivot now and kind of get into the go-do. And I'd like to just piggyback right on what you just finished on. Let's pretend that, our audience are taking a look at and looking for where are our scorecards, where are our KPIs? Do we have good alignment up and down through the organization? If we see a gap there, like, well, wait a minute, that's not as tight as it could or should be. Maybe we start with that one. What would be your approach to actually achieving a high level of integration? What would be the steps you might follow? Kind of the breadcrumb trail to get to from not so good today to what we really want to be like in the future.
You first got to prioritize the organization we talked about. You've then got to mobilize the organization, right? Because if everyone doesn't know what we're doing and why we're doing it, then it isn't going to be sustainable. You've got to condition the organization, and that comes through in performance appraisals, compensation plans, but just general lifestyle culture. And then you've got to execute, and you've got to execute very focused. And then the fifth one would be sustain. And for that, I see a lot of benefits from digital tools and infrastructure. It's a very focused methodology in order to get the entire organization mobilized and aligned around your focus initiatives and the KPIs. And then quite quickly, if your KPIs are off course, you know where to focus your attention.
So I'd like to go back to mobilize. That really caught my attention. You said that a little differently than I've heard it from others. So when you talk about mobilizing, that second most important step, give me a couple of examples, maybe a quick story here around in a situation where that was a big gap. What did you do to actually mobilize? Help us understand the sticky, what did we do to achieve the mobilization that you're envisioning?
Yeah, so there will be examples where I've walked in and, people have walked into a company and they'll see a vision statement or a strategy statement up on the wall, but people aren't living and breathing it. And in fact, if you went and polled employees, they would have different answers, right? So immediately, how can you mobilize the organization? Because they don't know what the true north is. And so if 80-20 is going to be part of your DNA, if lean management principles are going to be part of your DNA, if you want to competitively differentiate yourself by being more flexible, more tailored, more focused on the competitors, you've got to mobilize the organization around that. Otherwise, it will just be a nice slide deck on someone's presentation. It won't actually be part of the DNA. So how do you achieve that? Which is the other part of your question, right?
Yeah.
You've got to get them involved. In my view, you've got to get them involved in the process. I'm not suggesting an equal democracy here, but if you don't engage your employees in the process of creating who we want to be and why and how we're going to differentiate ourselves and our culture, not only are you missing out on good information that better informs you as a leader to make the final decision, but you haven't got their buy-in. You haven't got their fingerprints in it. And so when I talk about mobilizing, I'm getting the entire organization involved, as well as the customer feedback and who we want to be and why, how we're going to live, how we're going to hold ourselves accountable. What are the KPIs? Why are the KPIs important to hold ourselves accountable? And then you've got the organization mobilized.
Okay. So, let's just pick that 80-20 thing and we're moving down through mobilization. I'd like you to fill this in a bit, but I'm imagining, right, you go through and you take a look at, here's the 100 things we could do and here's the 10 or 15 that really make a difference, or the 10 or 15% of the customers. Let's just pick that for fun. And I want to mobilize around becoming very focused on how we treat those top 20% of our customers that probably represent 80% of our profits. Can you tell a little bit of story about what did that mobilization look like, right? I mean, who was involved? How did they get involved? I mean, just a little more granularity here in terms of how that actually works.
More than one example, but one example I'll give you is where all customers were being treated equally. There was no prioritization going on. And this is why it's important to get the organization bought into why you're doing what you're doing. But beyond just the kind of explaining why it's important to prioritize, we segmented customers. And for each segment, we created specific roles.
Like an avatar, or more of an organizational role, or
more of an organizational
value stream owner?
So this one example that I'm thinking of, we split our customer base into 4 tiers. Okay. And for the first 3 tiers, we created specific roles for those tiers. So tier 1 was key accounts. And so we created key account managers. And part of the reason for doing so is someone's talent to be a key account manager might not be translate to being good at business development and cold calling or reigniting lost accounts. So we segmented our customers. We had different roles for each segment. We had different KPIs. We had different incentive plans. And then the tier 4, the long tail, we attempted to push onto e-commerce. And so this would be an example of actually forcing that mobilization to prioritize customers.
Yeah, so I think it's a question. I'm imagining, you have to tell me if this is what you guys did, that this key account manager in effect became a value stream manager. They're looking across the functional organizations, right? The delivery of value to that customer. And they're kind of like the avatar, the ombudsman, the customer advocate, making sure that functionally across the organization, we were aligned about what we were doing for that customer. Was that part of their role?
That's exactly right. Yeah. The key account manager, front end and back end of the business, was taking care of their few select customers. And that's the beauty of it, right? If you apply the 80-20 principle, an example, you've only got a few customers, but you want your arms around them and you want to be their quarterback, their advocate internally with the organization. And it's not just a case of I take care of the sales side only. You follow the ball around the organization to make sure they're taken care of.
All right. And then what was the trick? Because what I've seen in the past is if we set up value stream owners or, customer advocates, it can break down between the silos, right? Because within that silo, call it manufacturing, they can have, 10 different customer advocates beating them up for performance. How do you get the balance then? Because, within manufacturing operations, you have to have, manufacturing operations manager, you've got the folks that actually make the stuff and move the stuff. How do you create the bridge then so that there's balance in priorities at that level? I know you've dealt with that.
Yeah, well, firstly, we've talked about the mobilization of the organization. So by this point, everybody should know why we prioritize in the key accounts. It's been discussed ad nauseum, right? And everyone's got their fingerprints on it. The second thing is in the KPIs, and the third thing is in the incentive plan. And the fourth thing is in the governance and communication. If you're constantly communicating why this approach is important to the entire organization, whether it's town halls or daily huddles, if people's incentive plans and KPIs are aligned around that fact in some way, then you've got a very good chance of keeping the overall organization consistently aligned and not in contradiction to each other.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Are there any other, go-dos, assuming those things you talked about are in fact gaps and opportunities? There's another area you'd like to talk more about the practical. Here's what we do to close the gap. So another area you'd like to delve into.
I think the talent piece, it sounds like a soft one given what everything else we've talked about, but it's, I think, really critical. Because at the very basic level, if you want to have consistency in approach, then you got to retain your talent. But attracting and retaining talent is so important. And so it's probably another discussion altogether in how you do that. But making sure that you measure your performance in that and you prioritize that, and you're making it an inclusive environment where talent can be rewarded and can be performed and recognized, I think that's so key. And if you're not doing that, it will undermine everything else we've talked about for the last 30 minutes.
All right. Very good. One of the things that I've had success with along the way is, some kind of method. I'm guessing you have a way of doing this. I just want to pick your brain here for a second is, I sometimes talk with organizations that there's three big factors to your ability to drive significant change, right? Significant, sustainable change in an organization. It's kind of a function of the vision times the discomfort level times skills. So describe that briefly. And the vision is, to your point, very clear what we're here for, what we're driving for performance, what we're trying to please as customers, what we're going to look like as an organization. That's the vision, right? The second layer is, and there's a percentage, right, of effectiveness from 0 effectiveness on vision to 100% effective. If you're not clear on a vision, we already know we're in big trouble, right?
Right.
To what everything you said. And the next one was a level of discomfort that we can create. Is there a burning platform in everybody's mind that we need to do this? Or do we have a lot of people feeling like, wait a minute, we're successful, we're making money, why do this? Or it doesn't, affect me, or I don't know how I'm involved. So how successful are we at really engaging the hearts and minds of every employee and stakeholder? Because you can go upstream to your suppliers or include them, your downstream fulfillment partners. Do they see a reason to do this? I mean, a great vision is one thing, but to have them believe it or be bought into it is massive. And then to your last point, which was crucial, do we have the skills to execute? Do we have the right people with the right skills in the right places that can actually do something to achieve what we're trying to do? And if you put a percentage on each of those and multiply them, you kind of get an idea of success. So if you're 50% good on vision and 50% good on, the discomfort part, you're only going to be 25% effective. And if you're only 25% of the way there on the skills, you're really in big trouble. Because now if you multiply those, you're only about 5 or 10% certainty of success. Do you have a tool you like to use? I know you're just nodding your head. You're obviously connecting the dots. Do you have your own preferred way of talking about that with an organization?
In terms of how we align the organization and drive that performance.
And then drive it into the skills part. In particular, it's the skills gap that I'm getting at here.
Yeah. I kind of go back to something I said earlier. You've got the customer feedback, you've got the organization feedback to create your vision, your strategy, your priorities. what does the organizational infrastructure look like to execute that, right? And I would recommend that people take people's names out of the equation when they're creating it. What's the optimal organizational structure to execute that? And then what skills are required for each of those roles? And then do we have those people? And if we don't have those people, how can we improve the people we have or bring new people in? And if you don't have that org structure that executes your vision, strategy, and tactics, if you don't have the right people with the right skills in place and you can't retain them, it will not sustain. So that's how I communicate it to the organization, by following it from top down.
Okay. Yeah, I did a really good job with that. And I'm really glad you came back and talked about the people side of it, because at the end of the day, the only true differentiator in an organization at the end of the day is really its people, right? Because we can all, have good engineers and develop good products. We can spend a lot of money on advertising and sales, et cetera, et cetera. But, we can buy the better equipment. We can put in our facilities next door to customers. We can do all those things. But ultimately, what truly differentiates is people.
That's right. I agree.
All right, cool. Anything else from a go-do perspective you might suggest to the audience, things they should go do based on if they assumed all these things we're talking about are in fact opportunities? Anything else?
If you've got buy-in at the top, because you have to lead by example to really adopt and execute lean manufacturing principles, I would also take a serious look at value stream mapping, and Kaizen events. And anybody who's familiar with the Toyota production system or the Danaher business system or all the offshoots that have come out of those will be quickly familiar with that. But that's something else I would look into, because it's finding waste in your process. It's challenging you to rethink things, challenging the status quo to find waste in your process. And by removing that waste, you get products quicker to customers, so the customers benefit. You, in most cases, lower your costs, so the P&L benefits. And you're certainly engaging and listening to your workforce, so the employees will benefit as well. I would look at those tools. There's many tools in the lean management system, and value stream mapping as being a powerful one as well that I've seen.
So let's talk about value stream mapping for a moment. I'm curious about your opinion here. I have strong opinions myself. Do you see value stream mapping as something that's done by, your black belts and top management, or do you think value stream mapping should be done in a different fashion?
You need someone, whether it's a black belt or something close to, you need someone to facilitate, but they're not the person who should be leading it. Certainly people at the top need to buy in, because you're asking a lot of your organization to do a value stream mapping exercise. And if the people at the top aren't bought in and leading by example, then they're going to see that and they're not going to want to do it. But ultimately, you want your people who are doing the work to be part of the team doing it, because if you don't have them, you're missing out on so many insights, so many brilliant insights. And then once you've done the value stream mapping exercise and you've moved on to the next shiny object, it comes to a grinding halt and the old habits come back.
Yeah, my experience has been, if we do it correctly, we're basically honoring the voice of our stakeholders, right? And we're listening carefully, because, properly done value stream mapping starts at the customer and what they're after, and we work our way backward, right, to our suppliers, ideally. But we're kind of on a treasure hunt the whole way. But we need everybody to understand what's their part in this bigger picture. Their voice gets heard and gets considered, and what items we choose to go fix and why, and then that gets communicated. So sounds like you would advocate for that very strongly.
Very strongly. And I've seen a number of times when I've seen employees say, there's no process improvement opportunities. The way we do it the last 10, 15 years is the way we need to do it. And you engage them in the process. And as you said, you go from back to front. So you're forcing people's mind to flip the process around. And you're looking at how many touch points and how much waiting time and how much items per area. And I think a 99.9% success rate are those skeptics before the process go, I didn't realize that. And you know what? There is waste there. And it's a very tough tool to implement if you don't do it properly. But when you do it properly, it's beautiful to watch the results.
That's awesome. All right. Well, man, this has been great. You, of course, have met my expectations and then some. I knew that the audience would get some really good, pithy insights around what are we looking at, why, and then practical how we go do it. So if folks want to get in touch with you and pick your brain or, ask some questions, how do they get in touch with you?
LinkedIn would be the best way. And certainly they could contact me through you as well, Ron, but LinkedIn would be the best way. David Hewitt, CEO, Charlotte, North Carolina. I'd probably have a good chance of finding me.
All right. Awesome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Ron. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.